Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. So I started recording this video about 15 minutes ago and my system locked up and it destroyed what I had. So very frustrating, but so I'm gonna try to do this again. We were just getting into the meat of it, so let's try this second time. Before I get started, we're going to talk today about Stoic physics, or if you prefer metaphysics, or if you prefer ontology, and I'll talk about what those mean in a second. It's been about 5 days since my last video, and I'm sorry it's taken me longer to get this out than I anticipated, just work and family and, life. So here we go. Before I roll into the details, though, I kind of want to set this up for you a little bit. So there's three basic topics in the study of Stoic philosophy: logic, physics, and ethics. And physics in the Stoic conception roughly is equivalent to what what Aristotle called metaphysics. So it encompasses both what we would consider physics and metaphysics. So the word physics comes from the Greek word physis, which just means nature. So for the Stoics, physics is just the study of nature, but that also includes the analysis of nature. What does it all mean? What's it all about? Aristotle separates these topics. So for Aristotle, physics is purely the observation of natural phenomenon, whereas metaphysics is this sort of what is it all about question. And for the Stoics, those are the same thing. In the same way that for the Stoics, logic or logos, reasoning, also includes grammar and the parts of speech and some theory about how we should react to things said. So it begins to bump up against ethics. For the Stoics, these three topics are considered to be topics they're separate only for the purpose of study. That you have to it's like the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So for the Stoics, how do you grapple with philosophy? Well, you chop it into pieces. But they were very clear that these pieces are part of a whole, and that they all fit together. And they use various metaphors to make that point. So there's a metaphor, for example, of an egg, where the shell is logic and the white, in the different parts of the egg. There's one where you look at it like an animal, like the bones are this and the sinews are this. The analogy that I personally prefer, even though it was one that some of the ancient Stoics didn't like, was the analogy of the orchard. So the fence around the orchard is logic, reasoning. The ground of the orchard is physics, the study of nature and what is. And the fruit of the tree is ethics, the part that you actually eat and consume. And I rather like that analogy. The reason some of the ancient teachers didn't care for it is because technically a tree, a ground, and a fence are different things. And you can have a fence around a hill with some grass without any trees. So they felt like this sort of missed the point, that these were all the same thing, just different aspects of the same thing. But I happen to like that analogy. So anyway, let's talk physics. In our modern way of looking at the world and analyzing it, generally people fall into, at least in the West, two big camps about what the world is all about. On the one hand, you have people who look at it from a religious standpoint. There's a God that stands over the world in a sort of authorial stance, the way that a creator or an author of some work directs it and produces it. It's sort of creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, and there's the creation and the creator are separate entities. And there's various theories about how involved the creator is and what exactly the creator wants from the creation, but that's the typical sort of a religious view is in that stance, that authorial stance, or that creation division. And then there's sort of pure, if you will, naturalism, or natural reduction, where there's stuff and it bangs against other stuff and it produces all of the wonder you see around us through, this is all sort of epiphenomenon. It's derivative of the interactions over time that built up. There's no wizard behind the curtain. It's what you see is what you get, and it's just stuff sort of banging into other stuff. Some of it self-directed, some of it random. And traditional classic Stoicism breaks from both of these categories. There's times where it looks like one, and there's times where it looks like the other, but really it has a totally different way of looking at the world. And I think you'll see that as we proceed. Now, I'm not saying you have to adopt the classic Stoic view, but it's important to understand that this is the framework that the philosophers who came up with this viewpoint held, this ethical system and this system of practices held. This is how they looked at the world. It's also important to probably point out that, Stoicism also is a philosophical school, and it lasts a long time. Stoicism is probably the oldest contiguous running philosophical school of the ancient world. It lasts for roughly 1,000 years as a single school, and that's it does sort of get subsumed into Neoplatonism toward the end, but there's a lot of people running the school. It's not necessarily the biggest, but it lasts a long time, and because of that, different heads of the school have different viewpoints, but this is sort of the view that is the most that has the most scholastic evidence behind it, and seems to be the most congruent with the great Stoic teachers that we know of, like Epictetus. So diving in, the starting point of Stoic physics is embodied existence. So the Stoics held that everything that exists has a body. Now, for the Stoics, a body does not necessarily mean, or explicitly does not mean, purely material. In fact, the Stoics held that every body is a mixture of some kind of matter or material substrate and spirit. And it is in fact the mixture of these two that produces a body. And a body is necessary for things to act and be acted upon. So only bodily things exist, and only bodily things can act or be acted upon. However, again, bodies are not purely material. And also, bodies are not the only things that are real. There is another category of the real in Stoicism, and these things do not exist, but they subsist. And these are given as primarily a void, place, time, and lecta, or sayables, which is to say meaning, the meaning of words or concepts. So these are the four categories of things which do not exist, but rather subsist. I'm going to give some examples of this, so if you're confused, just hang on a second. I think I can help clear this up. Some of the things that subsist have a further category, which is to say that they belong. So what does this mean? So there's a lot of different ways to sort of approach this, but the most straightforward is to say, okay, only bodies exist, stand out and in the world, and only bodies can act or be acted upon. But there are other things that are real, like time. Time is real. It's not an illusion, but time isn't embodied really. So what is time? Well, time is a rate of change over body in bodies, both in their own change and then in their relation to one another. And place is a spatial relationship between bodies, and void is sort of the absence of bodies. Meaning is a tricky one, and we'll come back to that. But speech, the sound pressure waves coming out of my mouth, that is embodied according to the Stoics. It's a body made up of air, to be honest. Just air pressure is a kind of body, a temporary one. It lives for a little time and then it dies, but that is a body. Therefore, it also has a spirit, which we'll get into. But the meaning of my words does not exist, but it does subsist as a sort of other layer on the speech pressure waves themselves. And just like place and time refer to the arrangement of bodies, if the time is the present right now, then we can also say that time not only subsists, but it belongs, in that it belongs to this arrangement of bodies. The same way that a specific location, Los Angeles, belongs to a certain arrangement of bodies, including the earth itself, right? But the Stoics felt that these were still real, so they included them in their conception of the universe. I hope that made sense. So bodies are all that exist, and they can act and be acted upon, but there are also things that subsist. Meaning, place, time, and void are all things that in some sense are, whether they're dependent on bodies or bodies are dependent on them, is not entirely made clear. And I think the reason that's not entirely made clear is because the answer is yes. Maybe we'll talk about that a little more when we talk about this union of matter and spirit. So how do matter and spirit fit together in Stoicism? Well, they talk about this concept of mixture. So when the Stoics are talking about the mixture, they said there's 3 different ways stuff can be mixed together. You can have juxtaposition, where stuff is just sort of glued together or placed next to each other. An example might be like a bowl of different colored M&Ms. So the different colors are juxtaposed together in the bowl, but they're not intermingled really. You could pick out, if you're a rock star and you only eat green M&Ms, you can pick out all the green M&Ms or have your production assistant do it. It's no problem. You haven't merged the M&Ms together. Then you can have a fusion. A fusion is when things are molded together in a way that they form a new third kind of thing, and you can't get the elements back out of it in any way. It's too late. So if you were to take all those M&Ms and you were to melt them and then you were to pour them together, you can't. Yeah, I mean, you could like freeze it and chop it up and make new M&Ms, but the M&Ms are gone now. They've been sort of blobbed together. Or another good example is, say, for example, the creation of, say, a child from the 2 parents, right? So the parents, the union of their cells, which create the or spark the process that creates a new human being. There's no pulling that apart again. that's the 2 things have merged and they've created a new third thing that's totally independent. And then there's a third type of mixture, which they call total blending. And total blending is when things are mixed together in a way that they completely interpenetrate each other. They're totally bound together. And when they're in that state, you cannot separate them in that state. But it is still possible to destroy that state and to pull out the original constitutive elements. So an example might be something like salt water. So in salt water, when you dissolve salt in water, it's totally dissolved in the water, right? It spreads out evenly throughout the water, more or less. It's one homogeneous substance. It's no longer fresh water plus salt. It's now salt water. But if you use an evaporator, you can still evaporate the water and have the salt left over, and then you could even condense the water, and you could have water and salt. The ancient Greeks also used the analogy of wine and water, and using a sponge soaked in vinegar to separate the wine from the water, because apparently this works. I haven't tried it, but apparently you can separate wine and water with a sponge soaked in vinegar, I guess. I don't know. So I like the saltwater analogy because that's one that makes sense to my modern brain. But if you want to get some wine and some water and some vinegar, and a sponge, or some oil and a sponge, because I think I think it might be oil and a sponge. But if you want to try that, you let me know how that works out. So the matter and spirit that blend together to create a body is an example of the total blending. So it's not that you have sort of like a ghost that sort of hovers over your body and gets sucked into your lungs and comes back out again. Rather, it's that in every cell of your body, every particle of your being, there is this union of spirit and matter. But depending on the spirit and the matter also are what enable bodies to act and be acted upon. So spirit is the active substance in the universe. It's what acts. But spirit does not. But matter is what's the passive substance in the universe. It's what's acted upon. So it's through the union of spirit and matter that we create bodies that can both act and be acted upon. And if this sounds an awful lot to you like something weird, like Taoism, yeah, I get that. And I'm sympathetic to that view. I think the more you think about Stoic physics and cosmology, the more it looks like something out of Eastern philosophy than it does something that we're sort of used to in the modern West. But yet it still has this sort of Western flavor. It's one of the reasons I find it so interesting. So the total mixture in bodies, there's a certain amount of tension between matter and spirit. And so this tension, depending on how this tension is arranged, determines what kind of body we're dealing with. So this is interesting. So at the very, very basic level, there's the resolution of this into what they call hexis or structure. I guess that's probably a good word. Cohesion is another way we could describe it. So simple cohesion is they're just sort of locked together. I like to think of this like a salt crystal. So in a salt crystal, it's a very rigid structure, and it has a crystalline matrix. The composite parts, they're in a fixed relationship, and this is the level of matter itself, raw matter. So mineral structures, bones, physical properties, what we might call solids, are in this state of cohesion or hexis. But then there's a state where the spirit and the matter are in a more fluid arrangement, and that they refer to as both, using the term again, physis for nature, or zo, life. And I prefer the term zo because I think it's more descriptive. And then there's a point at which the spirit is sort of in the matter, but it's not locked up by it. And that is where we get psyche, or psyche, or soul, mind. So these three levels of tension, hexis, zo, and psyche, are present in human beings. It's something like a mineral, like a rock, would only have hexis, pretty much. And then something like an animal or a plant is a better example. A plant would have like hexis and zo, right? It's got a structure and it's alive, so it has nutritive functions, but it doesn't really have much of a mind. And then an animal would have psyche, but purely an emotional psyche. And there's one little level above that where the spirit is sort of totally free. It's able to sort of fly free, if you will, still in the structure, but on top of it. And that we might call logike suche, or a rational mind. And that's something that human beings have. This touches a little bit on their understanding of human nature, which is we'll come back to in ethics. But you kind of get the idea. So everything you see in the world, according to Stoicism, everything that's embodied is in some degree of tension between spirit and matter. And depending on the type of tension and the degrees of it, you're going to see what kind of thing it is. At least that's my reading. And like I said, this is open to interpretation to some extent. And I'm not trying to be super precise here. I'm just trying to get you the basic ideas and the general flavor of it. So not only is the universe embodied, existence is embodied, and bodies are the union of spirit and matter, but also the entire cosmos is one giant body, of which we ourselves are parts. This is sometimes imagined to look like a silver egg floating in the void. There's probably some reference here back to the Orphic cosmology, but that's never made explicit. But this idea of the cosmos as a giant body made up of all these different cells, and we're part of that, is integral to the classic Stoic worldview. And just like the human parts are rational, are intelligent, so too is the cosmos. If anything, the cosmos is intelligence itself. So this whole world is said to be conscious. It's intelligent and rational, and it's also the ultimate standard of good. And like every other living being, it has a lifespan. It's born and it matures and changes and it dies. That's a weird idea, the idea that the cosmos could die. But because there's nothing else, it is reborn. And there is a cycle of cosmic death and rebirth. And this is referred to in Stoicism as ekporosis, or creation from fire. This is also, if you're familiar with Nietzsche, Nietzsche talked about this concept of the eternal return. Well, this is an idea he got from Stoicism. So in Stoicism, there is this idea of the eternal return, that when the universe is no more, and it's all returns to its original substance, which is held to be pure technikon, creative fire, which we'll talk about in a second, which is distinct from terrestrial fire. And then it recreates itself and is reborn. It's reborn in exactly the same way. It proceeds in exactly the same manner that it proceeded before. So you could think of it as a succession of universes, or you could think of it as one universe continually rebirthed. This touches a little bit on some concepts of like reincarnation, which Stoicism doesn't talk about, at least not in any source that I've ever found. Reincarnation is a staple of Neoplatonic thought, but not of Stoic thought, at least not in any of the surviving records that I've come across. I personally think this view is compatible with a view of reincarnation, or not. I think you can make either view work within Stoicism, even though the universe is supposedly cycles through the same exact pattern. That doesn't necessarily mean that human souls do, but it does mean that sort of at the end of your life, or however many succession of lives we get, maybe it's one, maybe it's a lot, when the universe does die and is reborn, we start that whole process all over again with it. So anyway, some Stoic teachers prefer to think of it as just an eternal universe, but this cycle is something they talked about. And the myth of the phoenix bird, the bird that burns itself up in its nest and then is reborn from its own egg and is sort of is immortal and self-creating. This is this myth, as far as we know, I think originates in Persia, but it's definitely one that was adopted by the Stoics. It's possible also that it was a sort of universal Mediterranean myth and all these different cultures sort of shared it. So if you think of the universe in that way, you can also sort of understand the Stoic idea of amor fati, or love of fate. Because the universe is alive and it's intelligent and we're part of it, our lives, our trials, our tribulations are all part of serving the need of the whole, which is God. Or we could also say that God is the active spirit that pervades the embodied universe. Because of the total mixture, the fact that the spirit is equally spread throughout the body, or interlaced with matter everywhere, but it's still in some sense one spirit. Because of this, the Stoics felt that there was a synchronous communication between all parts of the universe at any given time. So the bodies that make up the universe are not really separate. They're in constant communication, and because of this, the Stoics actually held. Excuse me, I'm looking at my notes. They're kind of scattered. Because of this synchronicity between all the parts of the universe, the Stoics actually believed that things like divination, communication from the gods via dreams, and divine intervention, that all of these things were possible. They had a slightly different view on what you should maybe do with divination, or if you prefer the term fortune telling, which I don't really care for, but the idea that you could seek out these oracles or messages, or they could be given to you, and how you should look at them, that's certainly something that the Stoics had a different take on than, say, your standard kind of gypsy fortune teller. But the idea that these things are possible and occur and are perfectly reasonable given the basic constitution of reality is something that I think modern people would find very strange, or do find very strange, when they encounter the classic Stoics. So that's a lot of information, and I hope you kind of bent your brain a little bit. It's not overly complicated, but the implications are significant. So one of the implications that jumps out at me when I contemplate Stoic physics is the question of, if everything that exists is embodied, and a body consists of matter and spirit, what is matter? And then that's a tough question today. That's a tough question even for materialists to answer. But from a Stoic perspective, is it embodied? Well, it can't be embodied because it's a constitutive element of bodies. It itself cannot be a body. So it doesn't exist. Does it subsist? This is a tough one to answer, and maybe I'll do a video at the end of all these sort of overview of Stoicism where I'll talk about sort of the things in Stoicism that I puzzle over, and maybe some preliminary solutions I've sort of worked out. And I'll point you at some resources where, if you're interested in continuing your education and journey in Stoicism, you can go do that. The one point I just remembered, I wanted to mention something about ekpyrosis, and the creation of the universe by fire. So the fundamental creative substance of the cosmos in Stoicism is fire, puer technikon, create, which means something like making fire, or a fire which makes or creates a power that forms things. Puer is fire, or pur. Excuse my Greek pronunciation is not good. And technikon means like, it's where we get the word technician. It means to make something. So this is fire that creates. The Stoics are Heracliteans in that they look at the fundamental element of the universe as fire, coming from, with the first person that we know of to put forward this view is Heraclitus. And maybe we'll talk about Heraclitus in a little bit, because I rather like Heraclitus. And this is very different than, say, the Epicureans, who are materialists. They're following Democritus and this idea that everything is made up of earth, bits of stuff. The Stoics, it's all this sort of divine energy. When the universe is destroyed, everything gets sort of absorbed back into the celestial fire. And the terrestrial fire and the creative fire, the puer technikon, they're very clear that they're not talking about the same thing. So they're very clear that when they say fire, they don't mean the stuff that comes out of a lighter when you click it, or that you stare out in the campfire. They're very clear that they're using this in a sort of analogous or metaphorical sense, not in a literal sense. So if you're going to nitpick over that, just don't. That's not what they mean. Whatever this substance is, it behaves in some sense like fire. Maybe here's something interesting that might help you wrap your head around that. So when we talk about matter in the modern sense, there's 4 states of matter. We're used to thinking about 3, but there's actually 4. So we're all familiar with solids, solid, liquid. In a solid, the molecules that make up a substance are fixed in place. In a liquid, they're sliding past each other, but they're confined. And in a gas, they're dispersed. Well, there's a 4th state of matter. And it's quite possibly actually the most common state of matter in the universe, and that's plasma. So in a plasma, there's an electrical reaction happening. The matter is actually giving off electrical matter. There's this sort of overflowing of energy that's happening. And we might think of that as the true state of fire, because when we see fire, we're actually seeing this, we're seeing essentially an electrical phenomenon, as near as I understand it, where there's a transfer of energy that's a sort of a runaway reaction, if you will, that's transferring energy. And so when we see flame or we see fire, we see light, we're actually witnessing something that's a profound transformation of matter. And so maybe we can think about that in reference to this idea of everything coming out of fire, and fire also generating everything else. But when the universe is destroyed in between its successive lifespan, everything returns to fire, and then it proceeds out of fire again. That's the Stoic view, hence the name ekporosis, or creation from fire. But that also would imply on a certain level that if that fire is when the fire, that creative fire, enters into the world, the Stoics often refer to it as pneuma, or breath, or air. So when they talk about spirit in bodies, they use the word pneuma, spirit. Even the Latin word, the word pneuma meaning breath or body, and the Latin word spiritus both mean breath. So this idea of air, wind, breath as somehow the derived property of creative fire, of maybe, if you prefer, the life force itself, the animating power, in the Stoic conception, God. This implies that the material substances that make up existence can be in some way reduced or absorbed back into this state and can be created out of it. So in that sense, we might look at the division between spirit and matter in Stoicism less as two substances that are totally isolated and more like a continuum of activity to passivity. We could also think about it something like the way that a coral is built up in an ocean reef. So there are these creatures that excrete a substance from themselves that hardens and calcifies, and that's how we get coral. So matter might be in some sense a calcination of spirit or of life. It's an interesting way of looking at things, and I think it's one that makes sense a little bit of the Stoic worldview. That particular analogy, by the way, is all mine. That's not something that I found in one of the classic sources. That's just me trying to wrap my head around this. I think I've covered about everything I wanted to talk about for this one. There's so much here, and we can sort of spitball and chew it over so many different ways. Next time, maybe we'll talk a little bit about what this implies for human beings and human activity when we talk about ethics. We might take a little detour and talk about logic first, just to kind of get that out of the way. There's some points that it butts up against physics, and maybe those are worth looking at. I hope this wasn't too rambling. I hope it was coherent and it presented you with some interesting food for thought. The relationship between the individual and the cosmos is one that I think we'll talk about more in ethics. But you should already have kind of latched on to the idea that while Stoicism does consider there to be one supreme being, the nature of that supreme being and the way that that supreme being, the animating spirit, the God, if you will, relates to creation is very different from the authorial stance that we're used to seeing in sort of the Abrahamic traditions. The Stoic God is nature, or in some sense is in all of nature. Yet they still felt that it's not a, for the ancient Stoics, it appears very much that they still considered the traditional forms of religious address, worship, adoration very much valid. The Stoic God is not an uncaring God, but it is a God that has a different relationship to creation and to creatures like us than the Judeo-Christian view of God. Anyway, I hope you're all well. I hope you're weathering this storm. It's I think there's light at the end of the tunnel, but we've been in this thing for a long time here, and this whole global shutdown thing. If you're watching this in the future, it's currently towards the end of April, and we're still dealing with pandemic shutdown here in the United States, and so just take a deep breath. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and thank you again for watching. And hopefully I'll talk to you soon. Okay.